excuse me, but this Quran burning, was it constructed by the interests of Turkey purposefully, or is it something really out of Swedish society? Is it something what would be constructed in the Russian style? You know, we don't want Sweden to be a NATO member, therefore we will find the cause.
I mean, there were a lot of conspiracy theories in both, as in the Turkish direction and of course in the Russian direction, because Russia would win out from this particular happening. But it's difficult to say. The guy who burned the Quran is Rasmus Paludan, is Danish-Swedish, half Danish, half Swedish. Is a right-wing radical, I think you have to say, you know, this particular variety where the only thing they talk about is Islam. They don't even talk about immigration in general, talk about Muslims and Islam. Then again, Muslims, Islam, Muslims, Islam. And he is, the Americans would say that he's a one-trick pony. Like he does one thing. I mean, if you invited him to Kaunas, maybe you wanted to talk, have an intellectual conversation with him. No, he wouldn't get one. He would burn a Quran because that's what he does, right? So he was invited, and to Sweden. It's not really clear how that happened, and he did his thing, you know. And there was then a debate in Sweden about freedom of speech. I mean, few people saw this as a sound development, as a good thing to do. And there is no, I mean, people have various opinions about migrants and about Islam and about, but there is no strong Swedish opinion who would support someone burning the Quran. It's seen as, you know, so it's a bit outside of the normal spectrum, so to speak.
Niklas, there I think we need to explain a little bit for Lithuanian and other audiences about a multicultural situation in Sweden, because somebody could start to believe, you know, that probably this is, you know, some strong movements of nationalists, you know, national socialists in Sweden. But I've seen a lot of mosques, endless of Muslims, you know, many of different faces and nations. It's probably one of the most successful multicultural society in the world, you know, and it's very strange to listen this, you know, accusation about Swedish fascism, you know, or some kind of terrorism. This is very strange. And could you explain this multicultural situation in Sweden?
Yeah, it's a very complex thing, of course. Now, this was actually really done by an Islamophobic Swedish-Danish actor, yes, but the level of support for this guy is very low, as you indicate maybe in your question, right? So I wouldn't be that sure that this is one of the most successful multicultural countries in the world. We have huge problems with integration, with long-term unemployment, with people, quite a lot of people still even not being able to read and write from some certain countries, right? And we have huge tensions, and I think it's a fairly, I mean, all major political parties nowadays, I think you can say they agree that we have made mistakes, that we were too generous. We took in more people than we really were able to handle. But that being said, the mainstream opinion still is that we should be a multicultural society. We should not return to some kind of monocultural Sweden that existed before, with all its advantages and minuses, you know. So most people, then most political parties, at least, then among the general public, you can have various opinions on that one. Sweden is fairly liberal, I think, but to a large extent, I think ethnic relations, if we take the Swedish majority and say the groups that live together with this majority, that's one thing. But then we have the suburbs, then we have the the districts where you have mainly non-European population, Middle East, North Africa, basically, right? And there is segregation. There's really a clear segregation. So so although this guy was not supported, there is something to play on, and there are potential conflicts in terms of criminality, in terms of social welfare, and so on.
Now, may I shift our conversation more towards Ukraine? We are witnessing now the war full scale. Hopefully that Ukrainian army will succeed chasing out of Ukraine's land Russian army. But I remember our conversation just before the war started, and we were kind of optimistic that Russia will not dare to invade Ukraine because there will be economic sanctions, its reputation globally will go down. And the feeling in our conversation before the war started was slightly optimistic that Russia will not be so insane. And now we see that it really shocked the world with the level of cruelty. Would you say that now Ukrainians who were divided ethnically as Russian-speaking Ukrainians versus Ukrainian-speaking and regional diversity, would you say that more or less the nation is united? Because there are some, as Russians say, полезные идиоты, useful idiots, who are not paid by Kremlin propaganda, but they do speak exactly what Kremlin propagandists want. And we have such people in Latvian Russians, in Lithuanian Russians, those полезные идиоты. But aside that, would you see, because you travel a lot to Ukraine, you live there, would you say that now Ukrainians are united one nation?
Well, firstly, I think many people in Russia, the Russian regime, very, very much would like that decision to invade not to have happened. I mean, they have our optimism would have been a much better path for Russia itself. Now they put themselves in this very difficult situation because of this. I think that the Ukrainian society as of now is as united as it could be probably in this situation. I think that since 2014, not only 2022 but 2014, there has been, and we can see this also in gallops and in research about public opinion, that Ukrainian national identity, not necessarily ethnic identity, but national identity is growing in importance in also in southern and eastern Ukraine. Although we should remember that this is one name for very different reasons. Kherson has always been more Ukrainian speaking and say pro-Ukrainian in that sense than, for example, Luhansk. It's not the same thing. I think clearly we can say in that sense that Putin is a nation destroyer, obviously, in the Ukrainian sense on one level. On the other level, Putin is a nation builder for the Ukrainian state because after annexation of Crimea, the Ukrainian identity has strengthened very much, and we can also see, and if for example, if we take the studies there was an article by Volodymyr Kulik, for example, the Ukrainian political scientist, I always wondered. Now, according to the census, then 17% in 2001 argued that they were Russians, right? But what does this mean? I don't see those Russians, especially in Bukovina, where you see some 11% are supposed to be ethnic Russian. But where are they? You hear the Russian language a lot more than like 11%. But there is no. I never felt that there's a clear sense of Russian identity, and the numbers that I saw from gallops was that maybe there exists a core group with a strong Russian ethnic identity of something like 5% of the population. So it's not that big as we should be careful about using the census numbers, I think, too much. There is a strong sense of growing Ukrainian, not ethnic, but national identity.
I propose to switch from ethnic discussion to the state discussion. Putin called many times that Ukraine is not a real state or even failed state. But after Prigozhin's action, Prigozhin's rebellion, we see contrary that Russia probably is at least half failed state or fully failed state. There is discussion, one side said it's fully failed state, and but I support that half state, partly failed, partly not. But in any way, in front of half-failed state of Russia, we see new threats for NATO. It's very different from that threats which comes from strong state. Strong state could threat us, by this its power, and failed state threats by chaos that could create, and this is I think this is new challenges for NATO meeting in Vilnius as well, how we should interpret the contemporary situation. And before this situation of failed state, NATO countries discuss only about defense. But now it's the question about possible, intervention in order to save some, nuclear bases from chaotic countries. How do you Russian chaotic groups, who could, these bandits who could kept this nuclear weapon, as well. So we see completely new situation. Do you hear, or could you present the discussion in Sweden on this topic?
Well, it's difficult to say anything conclusive on about the discussion in Sweden here, but in the general Western sense, it seems to me that very often those in Western circles who are critical towards a too tough policy on Russia, they use both those lines that you mentioned, right? When Russia is strong, they say that we should be careful with Russia. We should not challenge Russia too much because Russia is strong and dangerous. Then when Russia is weak and chaotic, we should not challenge Russia because Russia is weak and chaotic, and that's dangerous. So this is done, and I think you would find such voices in Sweden as well. But I think you pointed the way out of it in the sense that if Russia indeed becomes chaotic, then this really poses a danger, right? And you were thinking about nuclear bases in Russia. I would think about the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, for example, right? Some people say it's mined by the Russians, which I have no idea, but it might happen. So if there is a readiness for this kind of spot action, you would take an action, not in the sense of a large-scale counter-invasion, but this particular spot and that particular spot, then I would say that maybe would be very wise, because I think it would have been a much better signal to provide, for example, long shooting missiles to Ukraine, not only now, which they are maybe they will do, but say half a year ago, or maybe even further back. And then the argument obviously was that we should not provoke Russia, but that does not work. They don't feel Russia. They don't understand how this country works, I would say.
Yeah, I would add, that a couple of days ago I had a discussion in Lithuania television on the same topic. And we discussed not only Russia as a failed state and new threats concerning it, but as well about the Belarusian situation, in the Belarusian situation in the case of weak Russia, and weak Kremlin. What does mean it for us? What does mean, for example, invitation of Prigozhin bandits to Belarus?
Yes.
Or as well to building nuclear weapon bases in Belarus as well, near Minsk, or Astrov nuclear power station near Vilnius, 40 kilometers from Vilnius. There are many of threats. The same but different threats are discussing in Poland as well. We are doing it together. And this as well means that we started consider not only, as I said, defensive politics, but as well some proactive action possible, in order to defend from this bandit. And we don't see that NATO in general, except Poland, is ready, for such kind of discussion. Even it's not about actions, but about even discussion, which you mentioned as well. So we see some split, in between NATO countries, those who would like to support more active, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and those who are more or less passive, and those who are against this active, action. So this is, we see some disagreements between NATO members. And how do you consider that this one situation? Could it help? Could it be a wrong process? How could you react on this one split in NATO members' opinions?
Well, I mean, I think it's correct. Firstly, of course, I understand that for Lithuanians, what happens in Belarus is tremendously important for very obvious reasons. I think that we have this. Let's put it like this: Northern European and Eastern European, almost like axis. Sweden and Finland also more or less belong to the same Baltic Polish group. I would say by and large, right? Especially Finland, but Sweden too. And then on the other hand, we have downright opponents like Hungary, and we have those countries that have had intimate relations with Russia. I mean, like Germany, which have really begun to change their policies, but which might not be ready for talking about proactive measures, if this means some kind of military engagement in Belarus, for example, to protect NATO from this situation with Prigozhin, for example. And I mean, but there are a number of states, of important states in NATO, where there is no traditional, there's no history of negative engagement with Russia. Like, say, France, Italy, they have no tradition of having historical problems with Russia. Rather the other way around, you can say. Okay, Italy it's a more complex example, but France, Belgium, So I think there is such a division, and I really hope that. And I think that one should listen more to the Eastern Europeans, because this is about their security. This is not about the security of Portugal, after all. Portugal is not threatened. Maybe Portugal wants to trade. Portugal wants to build relations in another way. But the countries that are bordering Russia or Belarus are directly affected, and their voice should be heard. And I would have appreciated if the next General Secretary of NATO would be a person from, say, Poland or Lithuania or one of those countries. Right? But we have these problems, and I mean, I think it can only be overcome. It cannot be overcome in and by itself by discussion, and then we will convince them into taking our view. That will not happen. I think that it's the development themselves, more Prigozhin-like events, more chaos, and more things towards which we have to react. That might bring some changes on the, say, the French-Belgian side, but not. I'm sorry, I don't think this is about discussions in that sense.
Yeah, it is kind of evident that NATO as an organization has overcome lots of its own fears. If we remember the way Stoltenberg was talking at the very beginning of the war, that he was saying we will do nothing, we will not intervene, kind of pacifism. So that was also very similar to what Biden was saying, that we're ready to help to defend in case of NATO territory invasion, but we're not going to do anything. And now we see that every month there has been very significant changes. HIMARS, other weapons, then tanks, then possibly some fighter jets will get F-16. Every month there's a step forward. NATO seems to be much more now confident, and Great Britain seems to be forward with the chest pushed out as the leader.
Yes, I agree.
Really dictating the pace and the courage not to be afraid of Russia. And it seems like now the spirit is quite unanimous, and Vilnius stand could be really promising. What are your expectations for in that sense?
I think you are right, but I think what made NATO was more careful in the beginning, but what made this change was, of course, the successful Ukrainian resistance. Because I think there wasn't, and we know there's a history about, I think the German foreign minister expecting that Ukraine will lose out in a week or in a few days, and then saying that there's no need for us to send you anything, but because you will lose anyway. Like, so the successful Ukrainian resistance has made all this development that you sketch possible. The Ukrainian defended themselves with the means that they already had. And then because they made it successfully, more or less, rather more, meant that it became possible for NATO countries to send more and more important military help. So I will hope that this logic will continue, as Russia is perceived to be weaker. Maybe also they will be lesser. There will be less fears of sending, for example, the ATACM, or what it's called, the long shooting missiles, right? Hopefully.
Yeah, and okay, let's return to this situation of Sweden, And now we see differences between Finland and Sweden situation, and how do you think this was Finland's success? Why all countries, including Turkey and Hungary, supported Finland, despite Finland on the border of Russia,
Yeah.
It looks like, very strange. From this one position, if you are a Russian lover, you should accept probably Sweden, but not Finland. Why it's happened differently? This is very wonderful. It's very difficult to explain. What's your opinion about Finland's success?
Yeah, Finland, because of its position, its geographical position, has had to take a more adult position in a way than Sweden. Sweden came a bit later to this than Finland did, and of course because of the historical developments and the wars that are still very much in the memory of people. I think that Finland is seen in a way as a more pragmatic country. I mean, and I think it is a more pragmatic country. So there was no sense of irritation. They were less keen on, in Sweden we have this expression, a moral superpower, because Swedes are very keen on that people. We know we are small, but we are very wise and progressive. So people should listen to us because we have something important to say. The Finns are much more pragmatic. They don't believe that people would necessarily listen to them very much. So they do their thing and they support the general structures. But they are less provocative, maybe in some cases. So there was a Hungarian resistance, for example. Then, of course, since Finland has had a comparatively much less allowing migration policy, they are way lower numbers of people from other countries. They don't have a large Kurdish diaspora. Those people simply do not live in Finland to that extent. So there is no problem with kind of anti-Turkish, say Finland as a kind of anti-Turkish base or something in Turkish eyes. So that's also, I think, so it's very easy. It was easier for the Turkish parliament to swallow Finland, the Finnish participation.
And in this one, from this one point now, Sweden is surrounded by only NATO countries,
yes.
Norway, Finland,
yes.
Denmark, and on the Baltic Sea. You know, why does Sweden need to become a member of NATO if it is between NATO? It looks like because you sign two sides agreement, Nordic agreement. Why that's important to become, member of larger? Because in any way you are involved in all the security systems.
Right. So we can say like, and kind of everything is all right anyway. Yeah. Well, I mean, there is a sense of responsibility. We cannot put our security on Finnish shoulders like that, or on that we cannot do that. There's also a sense that this is now the right thing to do. This is an international moment and movement, and Sweden should be a part of this. I mean, this, you have to say, this is tremendous change in Swedish political history. Like, if you just take the opinion polls, like in 2021, there was 29% of Swedes in the most reliable polls were for NATO membership, 29% were against, and then a lot of people didn't really know. Just 1 year later, we had like 64% for NATO and only 14% against. So this, I think there has been no other question in Swedish recent, or I mean, like the last 30, 40 years history where we have had such a tremendous and fast change in public opinion over only 1 year. That's after the invasion. It says something about how important this was in the eyes of the Swedish population. So I mean, I think there is a sense that we want to be a part of this, and that we are not really safe without a NATO membership. We have parts of Swedish territory, like Gotland, for example, which will be incredibly important in the case of a larger conflict in the Baltic states, for example. And we would like to be a part of this larger structure, so there were lesser temptation to send rockets.
Yeah, Gotland, Iceland is very important, but now I would like as well to continue the same discussion concerning, to turn to the Kaliningrad district, because you in any way involved into this Slavic and political studies. And yes, you know this that many of politicians don't like to discuss this Kaliningrad problem, especially in Germany. Germans always try to escape from this question, you know. For them, it's like, you know, some trauma, historical, I see it, and they don't like even remember, like, you know, okay. This is, but in any way, for Poland and especially for Lithuania, Kaliningrad district is not the traumatic, but problematic, I would say, and very dangerous as well, because there is nuclear weapons, military bases, very aggressive country, and continuous rhetoric about building of Suwalki corridor, connection with Belarus, which means starting the big war between NATO and Russia immediately at the same time. And in another way, when we're talking about Kaliningrad district, it's immediately where we touch Gotland and Sweden as well, because this is very strange, but Kaliningrad defense completely depends from on the situation in Sweden. You know, it's because these two territories in front each other, you know, that looks like. It's so this is what is there is some kind discussion about Kaliningrad in Sweden, or zero level?
Zero, no discussion. Unfortunately, no discussion at all, I would say. But I mean, it's difficult to see what really could be discussed. I mean, in the case of this weakening of Russia, if this really would take place, I mean, it would be wonderful for the Baltic Sea region if you used the Muscovite terminology, a demilitarization of Kaliningrad, right? We should not be Putinists. We should not advocate the change of state borders and all of that. But demilitarization, if we got rid of the nuclear weapons on the territory of Kaliningrad, it would already be great, right? So that's what one could hope for, probably in the best of cases. But I mean, if otherwise, we have a large problem that is there and will be there. Without, what can we do? We can isolate it. We can protect ourselves, but with this Russia that we have now, don't really have any alternatives to deal with, except from defending ourselves.
But even though in Sweden you do not have a discussion regarding Kaliningrad area, but you probably have certain fears about the potential occupation of Gotland Island. Yeah. And you just got back, I believe, from Gotland. Yeah. Did you hear or feel being there? What do locals think? Do they have those fears because of the military ships in the Baltic Sea of Russia? Because we know that it wasn't the plans by Russia to grab Gotland as a strategic island.
Yeah. Well, firstly, I didn't see many locals, because this is it's the Almedalsveckan, it's called. It's a week where the politicians, journalists, administrators, all kinds of people gather on Gotland to mingle and discuss things, right? But what I have felt during this last year, of course, is that Gotland has been at the center of discussions about Swedish security. So when they are talking about, there has been less talk about like a general Russian large-scale invasion of Sweden, but there has been talk about specific Russian operation towards Gotland, and especially the context has been, for example, a Russian invasion of, let's say, Estonia or the Baltic states in general, and if the Russians did control Gotland in such a situation, it would be very difficult for NATO countries to defend the Baltic states. So and there is an event, there is clearly, but we don't have much awareness about Kaliningrad in that sense, in the public debate at least. But about this, there is an awareness. So then this is one of the reasons that Sweden still want to have NATO membership in spite of the problems, right? Definitely.
Thank you very much, Niklas, for your insights. It was a great pleasure to talk to you after some time and so many developments. So thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to